I don't need anyone to save me. I just need a chance to earn my way out." Those 12 words, spoken by a soaking wet, bruised 20-year-old girl standing at the door of the most feared motorcycle garage in Redwood Valley, stopped 30 hardened men cold. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, and nobody in that town ever forgot what happened next. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because what these bikers discovered about this girl shook an entire town to its foundation. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since early evening. The kind of cold October rain that soaks through everything, through leather, through cotton, through skin, right down into bone. Redwood Valley, Montana was the kind of small town that folded itself up after 9 o'clock at night. Shops closed. Streets emptied. Porch lights clicked off one by one until the only thing burning bright on the entire north end of Colton Street was the yellowish glow bleeding out from under the rolling doors of Harrison's custom garage. The sound from inside was a constant rhythm, the clang of socket wrenches, the deep idle of a test engine country. Music turned low on a beaten-up radio that had been sitting on the same shelf for 11 years. 32 men worked in that garage on any given night. Big men, quiet men, men whose arms told stories their mouths never would. The Hells Angels patch on their jackets meant something specific in Redwood Valley. It meant, "Do not bother us." It meant, "We are not your problem, and you are not ours." It meant, "Walk the other side of the street." And for the most part, the town of 4,000 people had honored that unspoken agreement for going on 2 decades. The bikers minded their business. The town minded its. Nobody crossed the invisible line that ran down the center of Colton Street, and everyone slept fine because of it. That was why when the side door of Harrison's custom garage cracked open at 9:47 on a Tuesday night in October, every single man inside felt it before he saw it. A draft of cold air. The sound of rain doubling in volume for just a second. And then silence. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of 32 men turning at the same time to look at the same thing. The girl standing in the doorway was small, maybe 5'4", maybe a little less. Her blonde hair was completely soaked, flattened against her face and neck in dark, wet strands. Her jacket, if you could still call it, that was a thin gray hoodie with a torn pocket hanging half off at the seam. Her jeans had mud caked along the knees. She was carrying a backpack over one shoulder, but the strap had been tied into a knot near the top, because the original buckle was broken and the canvas was dark with water. She was 20 years old. She looked younger. And across her left cheek, just beneath the eye, was a bruise the color of a storm cloud, purple-blue at the center, spreading to a sickly yellow at the edges. The kind of bruise that doesn't come from walking into a door. Everyone in that garage had seen enough of the world to know exactly what that bruise came from. She stood there for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, and she didn't say anything. She just looked at the room. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning from left to right the way a person does when they've been trained by fear to always know every exit, every threat, every face in a space before deciding whether to speak. Cole Harrison was the first one to move toward her. Cole was 44 years old, president of the Redwood Valley chapter, and the kind of man who had never once in his life been described as soft. He was 6'2", with forearms like bridge cable, and a face that had been rearranged slightly by a bar fight in 2009 that he did not start but absolutely finished. He had a daughter somewhere in Billings he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, and that fact sat in his chest like a splinter he'd stopped trying to remove. He crossed the garage floor without hurrying. The other men stayed where they were, but the wrenches went quiet. Cole stopped about 8 feet from the girl and looked at her the way he looked at everything, straight on, no performance, no pretense. "You lost," he said. The girl met his eyes. She didn't flinch. That alone made Cole recalibrate. "No," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. There was a slight tremor underneath it, the kind you get when you've been holding yourself together for a long time, and the seams are starting to show, but her chin was up, and her shoulders were set back, and she was looking directly at him with eyes that were pale gray and completely alert. "Then what do you need?" Cole asked, She shifted the weight of the backpack on her shoulder, and something about that movement, the slight wince that crossed her face when the strap pulled, told Cole that the bruise on her cheek wasn't the only place she was hurting. She said, "I need a job." The garage stayed quiet for exactly 1 second, and then Ryan Mitchell, who everyone called Bear for reasons that became obvious the moment you saw him, because he was 6'5" and 300 pounds, and had a beard that started somewhere around his eyes, let out a single short laugh. Not mean, just surprised. "You walked into the wrong place for a job application, sweetheart," Bear said. "Maybe," the girl said. She didn't look at Bear, she kept looking at Cole. "But I walked in anyway." Cole studied her for a long moment. He glanced at the bruise. He glanced at the torn backpack strap. He glanced at the way her left hand was slightly behind her back, not hiding something, he realized. Holding something. The strap of the bag gripped so tight her knuckles were pale. "What's your name?" he asked. "Avery," she said. "Avery Collins." "How old are you?" "Avery Collins. 20. "You from Redwood Valley?" A pause. "No." "Where you from?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Does that matter right now?" Cole felt something shift inside him. He couldn't have named it in that moment. He would try to name it later alone, and the closest he'd get was this. She reminded him of every person he'd ever met who was standing at the exact edge of what they could carry. Not asking to be saved, not expecting anything, just looking for 6 inches of solid ground. "You got family here?" he asked. "No." "Friends?" "No." "You got anywhere to go tonight?" The girl's jaw tightened. It was barely visible, just a small movement, but Cole caught it. "I'll figure that out," she said. "After." "After what?" She looked at him steadily. "After you tell me whether I have a job or not." Cole heard someone move behind him, one of the younger guys, probably Tyler, who was 26 and had opinions about everything. Cole didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Avery. "You know what kind of garage this is?" he asked. "Yes." "You know who we are?" "Yes." "And you still walked in here?" It wasn't a question. It was an observation. And something about the way he said it made Avery's expression shift, not soften exactly, but open just slightly. "I know what people say about you," she said. "I also know that in this whole town, on this whole street, at this hour, on this night, your lights were the only ones still on." Cole held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Come in out of the rain." "Time." He brought her to the small office at the back of the garage. It wasn't much: a metal desk, a filing cabinet with a broken top drawer, a coffee maker that had been there longer than half the members, and 2 chairs. He gave her a dry jacket from the hook behind the door. One of the chapter's old ones. A black canvas zip-up that swamped her completely, and he put a cup of coffee in front of her. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment before she drank, and Cole noticed that she didn't start talking right away. She wasn't filling the silence with nervousness. She was thinking. He respected that. He sat across from her. Didn't lean forward. Didn't crowd. Just sat. "What kind of work are you looking for?" he asked. "Whatever you need," she said. "That's not an answer." "Okay." She looked up at him. "Administrative work, organizational systems, inventory tracking. I'm good with numbers, and I'm fast with paperwork. But I can also learn mechanical work if you'll teach me." Cole looked at her. "You're serious?" "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." "Most people who come to us for something are either brave or desperate," Cole said. "Which one are you?" Avery was quiet for a moment. "Both," she said finally. Cole leaned back in his chair. The fluorescent light above them hummed. From the main floor of the garage. They could still hear the occasional sound of someone returning to work. A wrench, a radio, a low voice. "Tell me something," Cole said. "Why here? Why us?" And that was when Avery Collins put the coffee mug down on the desk, straightened her spine, and said the 12 words that Cole Harrison would remember for the rest of his life. "I don't need anyone to save me. I just need a chance to earn my way out." Cole stared at her. Something in the room changed. He couldn't explain it. It was like a frequency shift. The air didn't change, the light didn't change. But something in the weight of the moment settled differently. He had heard 1,000 versions of 1,000 stories in that office. People needing money. People needing protection. People needing something they couldn't say out loud. He had seen every angle of desperation, every texture of fear, every performance of courage. This wasn't a performance. This girl was not performing a single thing. She was just sitting there, soaking wet, bruised, completely exhausted, looking at him with those pale gray eyes, and telling him the exact truth. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was asking for a foothold. Cole was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You got one night. Sleep in the back room. Tomorrow morning you show me something worth keeping." Avery nodded once. "Thank you," she said. Cole stood up and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back. "The bruise," he said. "You safe?" Avery didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the coffee mug. "I will be," she said, "if you give me enough time." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked back out onto the garage floor and closed the door quietly behind him. Bear was waiting 6 feet from the door, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "Well," Bear said quietly. Cole walked past him without stopping. "Get her a pillow and a blanket from the supply closet." Bear stared at the back of his head. "Cole." "And turn the heat up in the back room." Cole picked up a wrench from the nearest workbench and turned to the engine he'd been working on before the girl walked in. "It's cold tonight." Bear stood there for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms, turned around, and went to find a blanket. In the back room, Avery sat on the cot they brought her and opened her backpack. She did it carefully, the way you move when every motion has to be deliberate, when you've learned not to waste energy on anything that isn't necessary. She went past the clothes, past the folded plastic bag that held her important documents, past the small zipper pouch with her medications and a single photograph she never looked at anymore. She found what she was looking for at the very bottom. A manila envelope sealed with 3 pieces of tape and wrapped in a single layer of plastic to protect it from water. She pressed her hand flat against it, felt the thickness of the papers inside. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew every page by memory, every number, every name, every date. She had been carrying it for 412 days. She put it back at the bottom of the bag, zipped it closed, set the bag beside the cot. Then she lay down, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, through the thin wall, she could hear the sounds of the garage, the rhythm of work, the low voices, the occasional burst of laughter that surprised her with how ordinary it sounded, how human. She had been so far away from anything that sounded ordinary that the sound of it now pulled at something behind her sternum that she refused to let break open. Not yet. She had work to do first. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 412 days, she slept without waking up every hour. At 5:40 the next morning, Cole Harrison arrived at the garage to find every light in the office already on. He stood in the doorway of the main floor and looked across at the office window where he could see a figure moving back and forth, sitting, standing, pulling things from shelves. He walked across the floor and opened the office door. Avery looked up from the desk. She had found the filing cabinet. All 4 drawers were open and sorted. She had made 3 separate stacks on the floor with labels written on torn pieces of paper. Current archive outstanding. On the desk in front of her was the garage's inventory log, which Cole knew for a fact had not been properly updated since March, and beside it was a legal pad covered in her handwriting. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before she'd changed into dry ones from her bag, a plain dark blue long sleeve and jeans, and her hair was pulled back, and she had a pencil behind her ear and a coffee from the maker in her right hand. She looked completely awake. She looked like she'd been at it for hours. "You found the files," Cole said. "The filing system is—" She paused. "It needs some work." That's a polite way to say it. "There are invoices in this cabinet from 2019 that were never reconciled," she said. 3 supplier contracts expired, and nobody renewed them. And your parts inventory log has a running error in column 4 that's been compounding the count off by about 12% since last February. Cole stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You calculated all that this morning," he said. "I've been up since 4. Cole walked to the coffee maker, poured himself a cup, and turned around to lean against the counter. "How do you know how to read inventory logs?" he asked. "My father," she said. And something passed through her face when she said it, just for a second, just a shadow, and then it was gone. "He was good with numbers. He taught me early." Cole nodded slowly. He didn't push. "What did you find in the outstanding pile?" he said. She picked up the legal pad and read from her notes. 11 unpaid invoices totaling just under $8,000. 2 of them are over 90 days old, which means the suppliers may have already written them off, but if you contact them now, you can probably negotiate a reduced settlement. 5 of them have documentation errors that make them legally unenforceable as written, which means you might not owe them at all. And the remaining 4 look legitimate and should probably be paid as soon as possible before they go to collections. Cole looked at her for a long time. He thought about what Bear had said last night after the girl had gone to the back room. Bear had leaned against the workbench with his arms still crossed and said very quietly, so the younger guys couldn't hear, "She's scared of something, Cole. Something big. You can see it in how she's holding herself, like she's waiting for something to come through the wall." Cole had said, "I know." Bear had said, "You sure about this?" Cole had said no, and then he'd picked up his wrench and gone back to work. Now he looked at this 20-year-old girl who had been awake since 4 in the morning, organizing 11 years of chaotic records and identifying $8,000 in billing discrepancies, and he thought, no, he wasn't sure about this, but he was sure about her. "Can you stay through the week?" he said. Avery looked at him. Something moved through her eyes, relief maybe, or something close to it, but she kept her face even. "Yes," she said. "You need anything?" She hesitated for just a moment. "A padlock," she said. "For the back room door." Cole looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. "I'll get you one today," he said. The first person who had a problem with Avery being in the garage was Dylan Marsh. Dylan was 38, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, which meant it was his job to be suspicious of everything. He took that job seriously in a way that sometimes crossed the line from vigilance into something that made the newer members uncomfortable. He had a lean face and close-set eyes and the kind of stillness that some people mistake for calm, and other people, the smarter ones, recognize as tension. He waited until the end of the first day to corner Bear near the parts bins. "She shouldn't," Dylan said. Bear was sorting brake pads. He didn't look up. "Cole said she stays." "I don't care what Cole said. We don't know who she is. We don't know what she's running from. We don't know who's looking for her." Bear set down a brake pad and looked at Dylan. "You think she's a plant, a 20-year-old girl with a bruise on her face and a torn backpack. I think trouble shows up in a lot of different shapes," Dylan said. "And I think the ones that look the most harmless are sometimes the most dangerous." Bear was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong," he said. "But you watch her today, really watch her. Then come talk to me." Dylan walked away without answering, but he watched. He stood where he could see into the office through the window, and he watched Avery Collins work. He watched her go through the filing cabinet with the systematic focus of someone who had done this kind of work before, not someone performing competence. He watched the way she organized the stacks not randomly, but by a system she'd clearly built in her head before she started. He watched her run numbers on a legal pad, check them against the inventory log, go back, recheck, correct. At one point, he watched her pick up the phone when it rang because nobody else was near the office, and answer it with "Harrison's Custom Garage. This is Avery. Can I help you?" Smooth, professional, like she'd been answering that phone for years. By 4 in the afternoon, Dylan had stopped watching from a distance and was standing in the office doorway. "You went through all of that today," he said. Avery looked up. She had learned quickly that Dylan was the one to watch, the one whose approval was hardest to get and most worth having. She had adjusted her posture slightly when she spoke to him, giving him more space, more directness. "Most of it," she said. "The invoice pile needs one more pass." Dylan came into the office slowly, the way a man does when he doesn't want to look like he's curious, but he is. He looked at the sorted piles. He looked at the legal pad. He picked it up and read through it. The room was quiet. He set the pad back down. "The error in the inventory column," he said. "How'd you catch that?" "The column totals didn't match the physical count from March," she said. "So I back-calculated. The error started on the February 14th entry. Whoever was logging it that week switched the column order for parts A and B and never caught it." Dylan looked at her. "Nobody caught that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." Dylan stared at her for another long moment. His eyes moved to the bruise on her cheek, then away, then back to her face. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked. Avery met his gaze. "My father was a financial investigator," she said. "I grew up watching him find the thing everyone else walked right past." Something flickered in Dylan's expression. Not warmth exactly. Something more like the beginning of a question he wasn't ready to ask yet. He nodded once and walked out. It was Bear who finally sat down with her at the end of the first week. Not to question her, not to test her, just to talk. He brought 2 sandwiches from the diner down the block and knocked on the office door and said, "You eat lunch." Avery looked up from the desk. "Sometimes." "Well, today you do." He pulled the second chair up to the desk and sat down and put a sandwich in front of her. "Turkey or ham?" "Turkey," she said. "Thank you." They ate in silence for a minute. Bear was one of those men who wasn't bothered by silence, who actually preferred it to noise, which was unusual, given that he talked more than most of the other guys when he did choose to say something. "You sleeping okay?" he asked. Avery looked at him. "Better than I was." "That padlock helping?" She nodded. Bear took a bite of his sandwich, chewed, looked at the sorted filing cabinet. "You know, you already did more for this office in a week than we did in the last 3 years. "You had a system," Avery said. "It just wasn't written down anywhere, which meant every time someone new came in, they made up their own version." Bear laughed, a big, genuine sound that filled the office. "Yeah, that's one way to put it." Avery almost smiled. Bear caught it. "There it is," he said. She looked at him. "What? First time I've seen you close to smiling in 7 days." He wasn't teasing. He was just stating a fact in the way Bear stated most things, directly, without meanness. Avery looked back down at her sandwich. "I'm not much for smiling lately." "Fair enough," Bear said. He didn't push it. That was the thing about Bear. He had this quality that Cole had noticed the very first day Bear had prospected for the chapter. Back when they were both much younger men, he knew exactly how far to go and when to stop. It was a rare thing. Most people didn't know. "Can I ask you something?" Avery said. "Shoot." "Does it bother them, the other guys, having me here?" Bear considered this seriously, which she appreciated. "Some of them aren't sure what to make of you," he said. "But nobody's bothered. Mostly they're just watching." "Dylan's watching," she said. "Dylan watches everything," Bear said. "That's his job. Don't take it personally." "I don't," she said. "Actually, Dylan watching makes me feel safer." Bear looked at her with interest. "How so?" Avery was quiet for a moment. "Because if something came in here that was actually dangerous," she said, "Dylan would see it before anyone else." Bear held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, a deepening, a kind of serious attention. "Avery," he said, "is something going to come in here that's dangerous?" The question sat in the air between them. Avery looked at her sandwich. She looked at the filing cabinet. She looked at the window where, through the glass, she could see the floor of the garage, the bikes, the men, the work, the ordinary, extraordinary life of this place. When she looked back at Bear, her face was very still. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But if it does, I'm not the one who brought it to your door. It was already following me when I got here." Bear was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he's made a decision that he won't explain out loud. He finished his sandwich. He picked up his wrapper. He stood up. "If something comes through that door," Bear said, "it's gonna have to go through 32 of us first." He left the office. Avery sat alone at the desk. She put her hand flat on the desk. Fingers spread and pressed down until she could feel the solidity of it, the real physical, unmovable solidness of the wood beneath her palm. She stayed like that for a long time. Outside, a wrench rang against metal. Someone laughed. The radio played something low and familiar. The garage kept working, and Avery Collins, who had been running for 419 days, felt for the first time since her father died that she was somewhere the running might one day stop. 3 days later, Dylan Marsh found the black SUV. He noticed it on a Monday parked halfway down Colton Street with its engine off and its windows dark. He noticed it again on Tuesday, same spot, same darkness. By Wednesday morning, when it was still there, and he could see the very slight movement of someone inside, shifting position, he walked into Cole's office and closed the door. "We have a problem," Dylan said. Cole looked up from the desk. "That SUV that's been sitting on Colton for 3 days," Dylan said. "There's someone in it, and they're not looking at the street. They're looking at the garage." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Plates," he said. "Billings County," Dylan said. "I ran it through a contact, registered to a management company, which is a shell." Cole leaned back in his chair. Both men were quiet. "The girl," Cole said. It wasn't a question. Dylan nodded. Cole stood up. "Keep it between us for now. I don't want her to know until we know more." Dylan stopped at the door. He turned back. "Cole," he said. "She told Bear something was following her." Cole looked at him. "She told him she didn't bring it here," Dylan said. "She said it was already following her when she arrived." Cole held Dylan's gaze. "I know," Cole said quietly. "I know." Dylan left. Cole stood alone in his office. I went to the window, looked out at the garage floor where Avery was standing at the inventory shelf with her legal pad and pencil, counting and recording with the methodical focus of someone who had trained herself to be useful, to be necessary, to give herself a reason to stay. She was counting brake pads. She had no idea someone 40 yards down the street was watching the building she was standing in. Cole watched her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and made the first of what would become many calls. The search for Avery Collins had found her, and the men who did not like to be on anyone's radar had just been put on someone's. Everything was about to change. Cole didn't sleep that night. He sat in his kitchen until 2 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee and his phone on the table and turned the same thought over and over, the way you turn a stone with your boot, not expecting to find anything under it, but unable to stop. The black SUV, Billings plates, a shell company, and a 20-year-old girl in his back room who had told Bear with complete honesty that something was already following her when she arrived. She hadn't lied to him. That was the thing that kept snagging in his mind. Most people who came through that garage door with trouble behind them lied first and told the truth later when the truth became unavoidable. Avery Collins had told Bear the truth in the first week without being pushed, without being cornered, without making a calculation about what it would cost her. She had simply said, "It was already following me," which meant she had known the entire time that it might show up, and she had come anyway. Cole picked up his phone, put it back down, picked it up again. He called Dylan at 2:15. Dylan answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "The SUV," Cole said. "Did you get anything else?" "I've been working on it since I left you," Dylan said. His voice was flat and focused the way it always got when he was tracking something. "The management company is a registered entity out of Billings formed 18 months ago. One director listed. Name is a lawyer, corporate attorney, clean record, no flags. But the lawyer is on the board of 3 other companies, and 2 of those companies have a shared investor." Cole was quiet. "Who?" "Man named Victor Langford," Dylan said. "You know that name." Cole thought about it. "Langford Foundation, the charity guy." "That's the one," Dylan said. "Annual gala. Hospital wing named after him. Face on the front page of the Billings Gazette every 6 months for donating something to someone. Completely clean public profile." "But," Cole said. "But his money moves in patterns I don't love," Dylan said. "I'm not done yet. But Cole, whoever that is in the SUV, they're not private investigation. The way they're positioned, the way they're rotating, they've done surveillance before. This is professional. Cole closed his eyes for 1 second. Keep digging, he said. Already am, Dylan said, and hung up. Cole sat alone with his cold coffee and thought about a 20-year-old girl with a bruised cheek and a manila envelope at the bottom of her backpack that she protected with the kind of care most people reserved for things they would die before losing. He thought, what did her father find? He thought, what is she carrying? He thought, how long do we have before whoever is in that SUV decides that watching isn't enough? He didn't have answers yet. But by morning, everything in the garage was going to change, because Avery Collins, who had spent 419 days being careful, was about to stop being careful about one thing. She was about to show them exactly what she was made of, and none of them were ready for it. The test came from Bear, and it wasn't planned. It was a Thursday morning, 9 days after Avery had walked through the door. Bear was working on a 2003 Harley-Davidson Road King that belonged to a member named Garrett, who rode hard and maintained poorly, which meant the bike came back to the garage every 8 months, needing serious attention. Bear had pulled the engine report from the file and was cross-referencing it against the physical state of the bike when Avery walked past the bay with her legal pad. She slowed down. She stopped. She looked at the engine report in Bear's hand, and then looked at the bike, and then looked at the report again. "Can I see that?" she said. Bear looked at her. He handed it over. She read it standing there, not skimming reading. Her eyes moved line by line the way her father's eyes used to move across a balance sheet looking for the thing that didn't belong, the number that broke the pattern. She found it in 40 seconds. Whoever wrote this report recorded a secondary chain tensioner replacement in March, she said. But the notation in column 3 says the original tensioner was within spec. Those two things can't both be true. If it was within spec, you wouldn't replace it. If you replaced it, it wasn't within spec. Bear stared at her, which means either the replacement never happened, and someone invoiced for a job they didn't do, she continued, or the replacement happened, but the spec reading was falsified to cover something else they didn't want in the record. The bay went quiet. 3 other mechanics had drifted close enough to hear. Nobody was pretending to work anymore. Bear slowly took the report back from her. He looked at it. He looked at the bike. He crouched down and looked at the tensioner housing. He stood back up. His expression had changed. "The tensioner's original," he said. "It's never been touched." The room processed that. Someone invoiced the chapter for a parts replacement that never happened. Billed for labor on work that was never done. Either that or something worse, a deliberate falsification to hide a different problem that nobody wanted documented. "How much was the invoice?" Avery asked. Bear found the billing record. $460. "How many engine reports do you have in the filing system?" she said. Bear looked at Cole, who had appeared at the edge of the bay at some point, without anyone noticing him arrive. Cole said, "Pull them all." It took Avery the rest of the morning and half the afternoon. She sat at the desk with every engine report from the past 4 years stacked in front of her, and she went through them the way her father had taught her, not looking for the fraud first, but looking for the pattern. Because fraud didn't usually happen once. It happened in a system. It found the gaps, and it lived in them, and it repeated itself because nobody was watching closely enough to catch the repetition. Avery was watching. By 2 o'clock, she had flagged 9 reports. By 3 o'clock, she had cross-referenced the flags against the invoice records and identified a discrepancy pattern that pointed to a single 3-month window 2 years ago, when a different mechanic, a contract worker who was no longer with the garage, had been handling service documentation alone. By 4 o'clock, she walked out of the office and found Cole and Bear and Dylan standing together near the tool wall, and she handed Cole the legal pad with 4 pages of organized notes. 9 invoices, she said. Total overbilling of approximately $3,200. 7 of the 9 point to the same source, a contractor named Marcus Webb, who was here from April to June 2 years ago. The pattern is consistent enough that I'd call it intentional rather than error. Cole looked at the notes. He passed them to Bear. Bear passed them to Dylan. Dylan read them twice. Then he looked up at Avery with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. It wasn't warm exactly. Dylan Marsh did not do warm. But it was something, a recognition, a recalibration. The look of a man who has been skeptical of something for a long time and has just been given a reason to revise. "You caught this from one engine report," Dylan said. "I caught the entry error from one report," Avery said. "The pattern was in the others. I just had to look." Dylan was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you catch this when you went through the files the first day?" he asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was a genuine question. "I was looking at the financial records the first day," Avery said. "I wasn't looking at the service documentation. They're separate systems. They should be cross-referenced. That's part of how the error survived so long." Nobody was reading both sets of records against each other. Dylan looked at Cole. Cole looked at Avery. He said, "Can you set up a system that does that automatically?" "Yes," she said. "Give me 2 days." She went back into the office. The three men stood together in silence for a long moment. Bear said very quietly, "Cole." "I know," Cole said. "She's not just good at paperwork," Bear said. "She thinks like an investigator." Cole looked at the office window. "Yeah," he said. "I know." Dylan said nothing, but he uncrossed his arms the first time in 9 days that Cole had seen Dylan Marsh stand in Avery Collins's vicinity without his arms crossed. That said more than words. What nobody knew was that while Avery sat in the office building the cross-reference system on a legal pad, she was also doing something else. She was counting, not parts, not invoices. She was counting the days since the SUV appeared. She hadn't been told about it, Cole had made sure of that, but Avery Collins had grown up as the daughter of a financial investigator who had made enemies powerful enough to kill him. And the first thing that kind of childhood teaches you is this: always know your perimeter. She had noticed the SUV on the first day. She had clocked the plates on the second. She had identified the rotation pattern. 2 people switching every 6 hours by the 3rd day from the angle of the office window, using nothing but peripheral vision and patience. She hadn't said anything, because saying something would require explaining why she knew what she knew, and explaining that would mean opening the envelope. And she wasn't ready for that yet. She needed more time. She needed to be more certain of this place, of these people, before she handed them a grenade and asked them to hold it. But the SUV was still there. And on Thursday afternoon, when she was deep in the cross-reference system and the office was quiet, she heard a sound she hadn't expected. The side door of the garage opened. Not the main rolling door. The side door, the one that faced the alley. The one that the members used when they didn't want to come through the front. She heard Cole's voice low. "She's in the office." Then another voice she didn't recognize. "I'm not here to see her. I'm here to see you." Avery went still. She kept her eyes on the legal pad. She kept her pencil moving. But every cell of her attention shifted to the door of the office, through which she could hear, barely just at the edge, the 2 voices in the main bay. The stranger's voice was male mid-40s, with the flat professional cadence of someone who spent a lot of time asking questions he already knew the answers to. "She goes by Avery Collins," the stranger said. 20 years old, blonde gray eyes, medium height. She's been missing for 14 months. A pause. Cole's voice. "Missing. There's a family member looking for her," the stranger said. Very concerned. "She has a history of," another pause, "the kind that felt chosen, instability. Episodes. She's been known to create situations for herself that escalate. The family is worried she may have attached herself to an organization without being fully transparent about her circumstances." Avery's pencil stopped moving. She sat absolutely still. Instability. Episodes. Situations that escalate. She had heard those words before. She had heard them spoken by a man in a suit in a wood-paneled office, while he smiled at a judge, and her world collapsed around her, and nobody in that room believed a word she said. She knew what was happening. She knew exactly what was happening. And she had to make a decision right now, in the next 30 seconds, about whether to stay in that office or walk through the door. She put the pencil down. She stood up. She walked to the office door and opened it and stepped out onto the garage floor. 3 things happened simultaneously. Cole turned and looked at her. The stranger turned and looked at her. And every man in the garage who had been pretending to work stopped pretending. The stranger was exactly what she'd expected. Medium height, expensive jacket, the kind of face that was designed to look trustworthy. He was holding a business card in one hand and a photograph in the other. And when she stepped out of the office, he extended neither. He just looked at her with an expression of practiced concern. "Avery," he said. Warm, careful. The voice of someone who had been trained to de-escalate. "My name is Richard Hale. I work with the Langford Family Trust. We've been very worried about you." Avery walked across the garage floor. She stopped 8 feet from him. She looked at him the way her father had taught her to look at everything, not at the face, but at the hands, not at the words, but at the space between them. Richard Hale had a second phone in his left jacket pocket. The outline of it was slightly different from a personal phone, thicker, the shape of something with an external battery. He was recording. "How did you find me?" she said. His smile didn't waver. "Victor has been looking for you for over a year. He's been very concerned." "I asked how you found me," she said. "Not why." A tiny pause, almost undetectable. "A routine inquiry turned up your location," he said. "You mean the SUV on Colton Street," Avery said. The smile didn't change, but something behind it did. Cole, standing 4 feet to her left, went very still. "Avery." Richard Hale said, his voice dropping into something gentler, something that was designed to sound like understanding. "I think there are some things these gentlemen don't know about you, about your history, about what happened after your father passed. I think it would be better for everyone if we talked privately," Avery said. "No. Avery. Everything you want to say, you can say here." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The garage was completely silent, and her voice carried perfectly. "In front of everyone." Richard Hale looked around the room. 31 men looked back at him. He looked back at Avery. And for the first time, the warmth in his expression went slightly cold. "You have something that belongs to Victor," he said. Quietly now. The warm, professional voice had thinned to something else. "You know what it is, and he wants it back." "What your employer is describing as belonging to him," Avery said, "is evidence. My father's evidence, which he gathered, legally documented properly, and which has never belonged to Victor Langford." The room absorbed that. "Your father was a troubled man," Richard said. "Toward the end." "My father," Avery said, and her voice did something. Then it didn't crack, but it tightened like a wire being pulled taut, and everyone in the room heard it. "Was the most careful, meticulous, honest man I have ever known. And what he found before he died was real. And I have it. And you can tell Victor Langford that the next time he wants to send someone to find me, he should send someone who isn't recording the conversation." Dead silence. Richard Hale's hand moved, involuntary, a reflex toward his left jacket pocket. He stopped himself. But everyone saw it. Bear moved first. Not aggressively, just a single step forward. And then he crossed his arms, and at 6'5" and 300 pounds, the effect was considerable. Dylan appeared from somewhere on Avery's right, saying nothing, just appearing. Cole stepped up beside Avery. Richard Hale looked at the three of them. He looked at the room. He looked at Avery. And then he did something Avery hadn't expected. He smiled. It was a different smile than before, thinner, cleaner, without any warmth in it at all. "This is a mistake," he said. "The kind that's very difficult to recover from." "Walk out the front door," Cole said. His voice was completely even. "Don't come back." Richard Hale put his business card on the nearest workbench. He walked to the front door of the garage. He opened it. He looked back at Avery one more time. "Victor is a patient man," he said. "He'll wait." He left. The door swung closed. The garage was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then Bear said, "Somebody want to tell me what just happened?" Cole looked at Avery. Avery looked at Cole, and she said, "Close the garage, lock the doors. I need to tell you something." They sat in the office, Cole, Bear, Dylan, and Avery. And Avery opened her backpack for the first time since that first night. She went past the clothes, past the folded plastic bag, past the photograph she never looked at. She found the manila envelope at the bottom. She put it on the desk. She did not open it yet. She looked at the three of them, and she said, "My father's name was Thomas Collins. He was a licensed financial investigator based in Billings. 12 years ago, he started doing contract work for a non-profit foundation. The foundation was called the Langford Community Trust. It's now called the Langford Family Trust, Victor Langford's primary charity vehicle." She paused. "My father spent 7 years working for them," she said. "And 3 years ago he found something. Not by accident he was looking. Because the numbers he'd been given to audit didn't match the numbers he could verify through public records. The gap was small at first, then it got bigger, then he traced it." "What was it?" Cole said. Avery looked at him. "Victor Langford has been using his charity foundation as a channel," she said. "Not all of it. Most of it is clean, real donations, real programs, real good work, which is part of why nobody looked closely. But embedded inside the legitimate operations are a series of fund transfers that go through a network of shell entities. The money comes in as charitable donations, moves through the shells, and comes out clean on the other side." The room was quiet. Bear said, "Money laundering. On a significant scale," Avery said. "My father calculated the total flow over a decade at somewhere between $40 and $60 million. He documented it. He built the case. He had names, dates, account numbers, transaction records." She pressed her hand flat on the envelope. "All of it is in here." Dylan leaned forward. "Why didn't he go to the authorities?" Avery's jaw tightened. "He tried," she said. 18 months before he died, he contacted the State Financial Crimes Unit. He had a meeting scheduled. 2 weeks before the meeting, someone broke into his office. His hard drives were taken. His backup files were taken. His contact at the Financial Crimes Unit was transferred suddenly to a different department." She stopped. "He still had his paper records. He always kept paper records. But suddenly he was being audited. Suddenly there were complaints filed against his investigator's license. Suddenly people who had worked with him for years stopped returning his calls." The room was very still. "Someone told Victor," Cole said. "Someone inside the Financial Crimes Unit," Avery said. "We don't know who. We've never known who. But from the moment my father made that contact, the pressure started." She looked at the envelope. "He gave me the files 8 weeks before he died. He told me if anything happened to him, I should keep them safe and wait for the right moment." "How did he die?" Bear said quietly. Avery was quiet for a moment. "The official ruling was a car accident," she said. "He went off the highway on a clear, dry night on a road he'd driven 500 times. No skid marks. No mechanical failure identified. Just off the road." She stopped. "Victor attended the memorial service. He told me how sorry he was. He told me my father had been struggling with stress and that he'd noticed signs of deterioration. He said it with such sadness." Her voice didn't change. It stayed even controlled, but something in her eyes was ancient and terrible. "Then 6 weeks later, his lawyers contacted me. They said my father had left unresolved professional matters that reflected poorly on his estate. They said there were questions about his mental state in the final months. They said some of his recent work had been found to be inaccurate, possibly fabricated." Dylan's hands on the desk in front of him curled slowly into fists. "They were building the story," Cole said. "They were building the story," Avery confirmed. "Discrediting him. So that if the files ever surfaced, they'd already have the narrative unstable man declining mental health fabricated evidence. Nobody would believe a dead investigator with a questioned record. And nobody would believe his 20-year-old daughter, who was described in the legal letters they sent as emotionally fragile and prone to paranoid thinking." She looked at them. "That's what Richard Hale meant when he said I had a history of instability," she said. "Victor built that story over 14 months. Every time I tried to talk to someone about what I had, there was already a file on me, a narrative that preceded me. I went to 2 journalists. One of them got a call before I walked out of the building. I went to a lawyer. His office was broken into the next morning." She paused. "I stopped trying to go to people in official positions. I stopped trusting institutions. I kept moving. I kept the files safe. Until you ran out of places to move," Bear said. Until I ran out of places, she said. And I ended up here. The room held all of it. Cole looked at the envelope. May I? He said. Avery pushed it across the desk to him. Cole opened it carefully. He spread the pages not to read every detail, but to look at the volume of it, the organization, the scope. Page after page of transaction records annotated in her father's handwriting. Account numbers cross-referenced with entity names. Dates and amounts and transfer pathways laid out in the careful layered architecture of a man who had spent years knowing exactly how to build a case. Cole looked up. He looked at Avery. Your father was thorough, he said. I was the best at what he did, she said. And this time, something did move in her voice just briefly, just a fraction of a second. He spent his whole career finding the thing everyone else walked past. He taught me how to do it, and in the end, the thing he found was too big for him to survive finding. Nobody said anything. Bear reached across the desk, and very gently, very carefully, he put his large hand briefly over Avery's hand. 1 second. 2. Then he moved it away. It was the most delicate gesture Cole had ever seen Ryan Mitchell make. Avery looked at the She breathed slowly. She put the evidence back in the envelope with the same care she always used. Dylan was the first one to speak. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. Okay, he said. Here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to pretend this didn't happen. We're not going to pretend that SUV isn't going to come back with more people in it. And we're not going to let a 20-year-old woman carry this alone for one more day. He looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him. And in that look passed something that needed no words, because they had been in the same chapter for 16 years and had learned over those years to communicate in the shorthand of men who trusted each other absolutely. Cole said Dylan, the SUV. I'll handle it tonight, Dylan said. Cole said Bear, the attorney. I'll call Marcus in the morning, Bear said. He's been with us for 8 years. He's solid. Cole looked at Avery. You're not alone anymore, he said, simply, without ceremony or drama. Whatever this is, it's not just yours to carry. You understand me? Avery looked at him. She had told herself for 422 days that she didn't need anyone. That needing someone was a luxury she couldn't afford. That the only person she could trust was herself. She had built her whole survival on that principle, and it had kept her alive, and it had kept the evidence safe, and it had also hollowed her out slowly. The way wind hollows out a cliff face. Not all at once, but grain by grain over time, until the structure is still standing, but has lost something essential from inside. She looked at Cole Harrison, 44 years old, hard-faced, kind-eyed, a man who had given her a padlock and a cot and a chance to prove herself, and she felt something she hadn't felt since she was 17 years old, and her father was still alive, and the world still seemed like a place that could be navigated by honest people doing honest work. She felt for just a moment less hollow. I understand, she said. Cole nodded once. He picked up the envelope and handed it back to her. Keep it safe, he said. Keep it close. We move carefully from here. Avery put the envelope back in the bag. She zipped it closed. She set it beside her chair. Dylan stood and walked out without another word, which meant he was already working. Bear stood and said, I'm making coffee. Real coffee, not that stuff from the pot. He looked at Avery. You want some? Yes, she said. Thank you. Bear left. Cole stood alone with Avery for a moment. He looked at her. He said, that thing you said the first night, about earning your way out. Yes, she said. You already earned your way in, he said. The rest, he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, we figure out together. He walked out. Avery sat alone in the office. Through the window, she could see the garage floor coming back to life, men returning to work, the sound of tools, the low radio, the ordinary rhythm of a place that worked hard and asked no more than that from the people inside it. She looked at the cross-reference system on the legal pad. She picked up her pencil. And in the small, deliberate brick-by-brick way she had always done things the way her father had taught her, she went back to work. Because outside on Colton Street, the SUV was gone. But Richard Hale's last words were still sitting in the room. Victor is a patient man. He'll wait. And Avery Collins, who had been waiting 422 days herself, thought so will I. The difference was that this time, she wasn't waiting alone. Marcus Webb called on a Friday. Not the Marcus Webb from the falsified invoices, a different Marcus entirely. Marcus Reeves, the attorney Bear had mentioned, the one who had handled the chapter's legal work for 8 years, and who picked up the phone on the second ring when Bear called at 7 in the morning and said without any preamble, "I need you to look at something, today." Marcus arrived at the garage at 10. He was 61 years old, a compact man with silver hair and reading glasses that lived permanently pushed up on his forehead, and he had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where everything said can be used against someone. He didn't rattle. He didn't perform. He sat down across from Avery in the office with his hands folded on the desk and said, "Walk me through it from the beginning. Leave nothing out. I'll stop you when I have questions." Avery walked him through it. It took 2 hours. Marcus asked 12 questions. Precise, specific technical questions about documentation chains and notarization and the legal status of evidence gathered during contracted professional work. He asked about the timeline of her father's contact with the Financial Crimes Unit. He asked about the nature of the legal letters Victor's attorneys had sent. He looked at every page of the envelope, slowly reading in the way lawyers read, not for the story, but for the gaps, the places where the argument could be attacked. When she finished, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your father built an extraordinary case." Avery said, "But..." Marcus looked at her over his folded hands. "No but. I said what I said. This is extraordinary work." He paused. "The problem is not the evidence. The problem is the pathway. Every official channel your father tried was compromised before he could get the evidence into the right hands. That means we can't go through standard channels without the very real risk of tipping Langford's contacts before the case is secured. So what do we do?" Bear said. He was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, listening. "We build a different kind of pressure," Marcus said. "Not from inside the system, not at first. From outside it." He looked at Avery. "You said 2 journalists were contacted before you could get to them. That means someone was tracking your movement in advance, which means Langford had and may still have access to communications you were using at the time. Phone, email, social." Avery nodded. She'd known that. She'd stopped using her real phone on day 40. "How are you communicating now?" Marcus asked. "Cash phone," she said. "Bought in a different state. No account linked to my name." Marcus nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted, a respect, quiet and unspoken, for the practical intelligence of the girl sitting across from him. "Good," he said. "Here's what I want to do. I have a contact, a journalist, old friend, been doing investigative work for 22 years. She's based in Missoula. She doesn't take calls from unknown numbers, and she doesn't meet people she hasn't vetted. But she'll meet me." He paused. "And if I bring her what you've just shown me, she will know exactly what to do with it." "What does that mean?" Cole said. He was leaning against the wall behind Avery. "It means we build the public case in parallel with the legal case," Marcus said. "You go to the authorities first. Without the public pressure, Langford's people bury it again. But if a credible journalist is already working the story, already verifying the documents, already talking to sources, the moment anyone tries to suppress it, they make it bigger." He looked at Avery. "This is how you put something in a position where it can't be quietly killed. You make it too loud to silence." The room held that. Avery was looking at Marcus with an expression Cole couldn't entirely read, something between hope and something more cautious than hope. Something that had been burned too many times to open fully. "I've heard strategies before," she said quietly. "In the beginning, when I still thought there was a clean way through this. Every strategy had a weakness. Victor found every weakness." "He found every weakness," Marcus said, "because you were working alone, or with people who were reachable, people he could get to." He looked around the office at Cole, at Bear, in the doorway, back at Avery. "You're not working alone anymore." The silence that followed was the specific silence of something shifting. Cole said, "Make the call to Missoula." Marcus picked up his phone. What none of them knew yet was that while Marcus was dialing, something was already moving in the other direction, something that would force their hand much sooner than any of them had planned. Because Richard Hale had not gone back to Victor Langford with a simple report. He had gone back with a recommendation. And Victor Langford, who was indeed a patient man, had just decided that his patience was finished. It was Dylan who found out first, because Dylan's job was to know things before other people knew them, and he was very good at his job. He came into the garage at noon on Friday, with the flat, contained expression he wore when the information he was carrying was serious enough that he needed to deliver it without his own reaction attached to it. He found Cole at the workbench. He said quietly, "Victor Langford filed a police report this morning in Billings. He's claiming Avery stole proprietary documents belonging to the Langford Family Trust during her time as a minor dependent in his care." Cole's hands went still on the wrench. "She was never his dependent," Cole said. "He's claiming guardianship was informally established after her father's death," Dylan said. "He has a signed affidavit from two people, I don't have their names yet, attesting that Thomas Collins designated Langford as a responsible party for Avery's welfare in the event of his death." Cole set the wrench down. "That's fabricated," he said. "Completely," Dylan said. "But it's signed and notarized and filed with the Billings District Court as of 9 this morning, which means at some point today or tomorrow, someone is going to call the Redwood Valley Police Department with a request to locate and detain Avery Collins pending investigation." The two men looked at each other. "How long?" Cole said. "If the Billings DA fast-tracks it, which with Langford's connections, he absolutely can, 24 hours, maybe less." Cole was quiet for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then he turned and walked directly to the office. Avery was at the desk working on the cross-reference system. She looked up when Cole came in and read his face immediately. Read it the way she read everything quickly, accurately, without flinching from what she saw. "What happened?" she said. Cole told her. He told her clearly, without softening it, because she was not a person who needed things softened, and treating her like one would be an insult to everything she'd already survived. When he finished, Avery was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He filed in Billings, not here." "Yes, because his contacts are in Billings. He'd need to route a request to Redwood Valley through channels he doesn't control as completely." Her mind was already moving. Cole could see it the way her eyes focused inward, processing. "That buys us something." "Marcus is already making calls," Cole said. "Who's the contact in Redwood Valley PD?" Avery said. Cole paused. "Why?" "Because I want to know if there's anyone on the Redwood Valley force who has a connection to Langford's network," she said. "Before the request comes through, before someone makes a decision about how to respond to it." Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and called for Dylan. Dylan appeared in the doorway. "Redwood Valley PD," Cole said. "Anyone connected to Billings money?" Dylan didn't hesitate. "Captain Reyes has a brother-in-law who works for one of Langford's subsidiary companies. It's public record, construction firm." Avery said, "Then the request can't go through Reyes." "How do we control who it goes through?" Bear said. He'd appeared behind Dylan. "Marcus can," Avery said. She was already on her feet. "If Marcus contacts the right person in the department before the request arrives, someone who isn't connected, and flags the conflict of interest, the request has to be rerouted. It doesn't stop it, but it slows it. And it creates a record that there was an attempt to manipulate the process." The three men looked at her. Bear said low and sincere, "You think like your father." Avery looked at him. Something passed through her face. Grief and pride so tangled together they couldn't be separated. "That's the point," she said. She walked past them into the main floor of the garage and said, "I need to call Marcus, now." The next 6 hours were the most concentrated work any of them had done in years. Not mechanical work, not the comfortable physical work of engines and tools, but the harder, more exhausting work of moving pieces on a board where the opponent had more pieces and more time, and the board itself was tilted in his favor. Marcus made 4 calls. He reached his contact in Missoula, the journalist, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who listened to the summary Marcus gave her in a flat, attentive silence, and then said, "I'm going to need to see the documents myself, not copies. The originals. Marcus said, I know. We're working on the secure transfer. Sandra said, how much time do we have? Marcus said, we think 24 hours before a police request lands in Redwood Valley. Sandra was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I'll be there in the morning. Dylan ran down the conflict of interest documentation on Captain Reyes's brother-in-law and delivered it to Marcus, who filed a formal notification with the Redwood Valley PD's Oversight Office, citing the connection and requesting that any requests originating from Billings regarding Avery Collins be routed through a different command structure. The woman who received that notification, a sergeant named Pauline Cruz, who had been with the department for 19 years and took procedural integrity seriously enough that 3 previous captains had found her tiresome. Reddit looked at the file and picked up the phone. What she said on that call and to whom would matter enormously, but they wouldn't know that until later. In the meantime, Avery sat with Cole in the office and did something she hadn't done since this all began. She talked about her father, not strategically, not as part of building the case, just talked. Because Cole had asked her quietly during a moment when the office was empty and the work had briefly stalled. Tell me something about him. Not the case, just him. And Avery had looked at Cole with those pale gray eyes for a long moment, like someone standing at the edge of water they're not sure is safe, and then she'd said, he used to make breakfast for dinner, every Friday night, eggs and toast and orange juice at 7 o'clock in the evening. He said breakfast food tasted better when it was a surprise. Cole said, that sounds like a good man. How was, she said. He was the kind of good that's very quiet. He didn't announce it, he just was it. Consistently, even when it cost him. Cole nodded. He sounds like he raised you right, Cole said. Avery was quiet for a moment. He raised me to look for the thing everyone else walked past, she said. I didn't understand why he thought that was so important until Victor Langford went to his memorial service and cried at the coffin of the man he'd destroyed. She paused. And everyone in that room believed him, because nobody was looking past the tears. Cole didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would be better than silence. After a moment, Avery said, can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you let me stay that first night? You didn't know me. You had every reason to say no. Cole thought about it honestly. You reminded me of someone, he said, who, I was quiet for a moment. My daughter, he said. She's about your age. We haven't talked in a while. He looked at the coffee maker. She asked me for help once a few years back, and I was too proud to admit I didn't know how to give it. So I gave her the wrong kind of help instead. The kind that looked like help, but was really just me feeling better about myself. He paused. When you walked in that door and said you didn't need anyone to save you, just a chance to earn your way out. I thought that's the sentence I needed to hear 3 years ago. Avery looked at him for a long moment. Maybe it's not too late, she said. To call her. Cole glanced at her sideways. Something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but its close neighbor. You fixing my life now too, he said. I fix things, Avery said. It's what I do. And for the first time in the garage office in the middle of the most difficult 24 hours she'd had in months, Avery Collins smiled. It was a small thing. It didn't last long. But Bear, who happened to walk past the office window at that exact moment, saw it, and stopped and looked and felt something move in his chest that he would have died before describing out loud, but which was simply relief. The kind of relief you feel when something you were afraid was permanently broken turns out to still be able to make light. He walked on without stopping. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. Sandra Okafor arrived at 8:45 in the morning. She was 53, Nigerian-American with natural hair and reading glasses, and an expression of permanent focused intelligence that reminded Avery sharply and painfully of her father. She came alone. She drove a 12-year-old Subaru. She walked into the garage carrying a laptop bag and a thermos, and she looked around the space with the specific attention of someone who is automatically cataloging information in every environment she enters. She looked at the bikers. The bikers looked at her. Bear said, "Coffee." Sandra said, "Please." They set up in the office. Claire, Dylan, Marcus, Sandra, and Avery, and the envelope in the center of the desk. Sandra read every page. She read them the way Marcus had methodically, technically, with questions that were precise and showed exactly how much she already understood about financial architecture and shell structures and the specific mechanics of money laundering through charitable foundations. She asked Avery about her father's methodology. Avery explained. She asked about the timeline. Avery laid it out. She asked about Victor's response pattern, the audit, the license complaints, the legal letters, the guardianship fabrication, and listened with a stillness that Avery recognized as the stillness of someone assembling pieces into a structure that was becoming page by page undeniable. When Sandra was done, she closed the last page, took off her glasses, and looked at Avery directly. "How old were you when your father gave you these files?" Sandra said. 18, Avery said. "And you've carried them for 14 months. Yes. Alone. Until now." Sandra held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the envelope. Then she looked back at Avery. "Your father was right," she said. "This is real. This is verifiable. And it's big enough that I understand why people got hurt trying to get it out." She paused. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Okay," Avery said. "Is there anything in here you're not sure about? Anything your father might have been wrong about or might have interpreted incorrectly? I'm not asking to undermine him. I'm asking because when I publish this, I need to be able to defend every single claim, and I need to know now if there are any weak points." Avery looked at the envelope. She thought about her father, the Friday breakfast dinners, the quiet goodness, the methodology that was so careful, it almost cost him the whole career, long before it cost him his life. She thought about the hours she had spent since she was 18, going over these records, cross-referencing them against public records, checking his calculations, tracing his sourcing. "Page 31, she said. "The transaction dated March 14th, 11 years ago. His notation says the transfer amount was $1.2 million. The publicly available record shows 1.18. The discrepancy is within the range that could be rounding, or it could be a split transfer he didn't fully trace. I've never been able to resolve it." Sandra looked at her. "That's the only one," Sandra said. "That's the only one," Avery said. Sandra made a note. She put her glasses back on. She looked at Marcus. "I can work with this." Marcus said, "Timeline." Sandra said, "I need 2 weeks to verify independently. I won't publish without independent verification, that's non-negotiable. But I can build the verification track in parallel with the legal filing." She looked at Cole. "Can she stay safe for 2 weeks?" Cole looked at Dylan. Dylan said, "We can keep this garage secure, but if Langford escalates..." "He will," Avery said, quietly with certainty, without drama. "When Richard Hale reports that I have allies now, people with resources and legal support, Victor will escalate. He doesn't respond to resistance by backing off. He responds by applying more pressure." She paused. "That's what happened to my father." The room absorbed that. Sandra was looking at Avery with an expression that had moved beyond professional assessment into something more personal. The look of a woman who had spent decades finding people, the powerful wanted silenced, and who never entirely stopped feeling the specific weight of that. "Then we work fast," Sandra said. She picked up her thermos, took a drink of coffee, opened her laptop. "Start from the beginning," she said to Avery. "Tell me everything in order. I need to hear it in your words." Avery looked at her for a moment. Then she began. It was 2 hours into Sandra's interview with Avery when Dylan's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but Cole, who had been watching Dylan for 16 years, saw his jaw tighten by approximately 2 millimeters, which in Dylan's vocabulary was the equivalent of someone else going pale. Dylan stood up quietly and walked out of the office. Cole followed him. They stood in the main bay 10 feet from the office door, and Dylan said, "The police request came through." "Already," Cole said. "Langford pushed it faster than we expected," Dylan said. "But here's the thing. It went through Sergeant Cruz's desk, not Reyes. Marcus's filing worked. Cruz reviewed it and flagged the Reyes conflict before routing it. So it's delayed." "Better than delayed," Dylan said. Cruz contacted the state attorney general's office this morning, not to report Avery, to report the conflict of interest and request guidance on how to handle what she described as a potentially politically influenced detention request. Dylan paused. She used those words specifically. Politically influenced. Cole stared at him. She's protecting the request from being manipulated, Cole said. Cruz is clean, Dylan said. 23 years on the force. She doesn't like dirty water. The AG's office is now involved, which means any move Langford's Billings contacts make to push this through will have the AG watching. Cole was quiet for a long moment. That's a problem for Victor, he said. That's a significant problem for Victor, Dylan said. Because the AG's office doesn't just watch things, they ask questions. And questions about why a request was being fast-tracked through a department with a documented conflict of interest are exactly the kind of questions that start to pull threads. Cole looked toward the office through the glass, where he could see Avery sitting across from Sandra talking clearly, steadily with the precise and organized intelligence that her father had spent years shaping. He overplayed, Cole said. He's not used to resistance with resources, Dylan said. He's used to isolated people with no support. He applied his standard pressure on the assumption that she was still alone. Dylan's voice was flat and factual. She's not alone anymore, and he hasn't recalibrated. Cole nodded slowly. Keep watching the AG contact, he said. And I want someone on the physical perimeter tonight. If Langford decides to move before Cruz's process plays out, he won't send Richard Hale with a business card this time. Dylan said, already arranged. He walked back toward the side door. Cole went back into the office. Sandra looked up. Avery looked up. Cole said, we have a development. He told them about Cruz, about the AG office, about the conflict of interest flag. Sandra's eyes sharpened. She was already typing. That's on the record, she said. That is a documented, traceable moment in this story, and I want every detail of it. She looked at Cole. Who filed the conflict of interest notification? Our attorney Marcus Reeves, Cole said. I want to talk to him, today. Cole pulled out his phone. Avery was looking at the desk. Her hands were flat on the surface, fingers spread, and Cole recognized the gesture, the same one she'd made alone in the office after Bear left, pressing down against the solidness of something real and unmovable. He'd seen her do it when things shifted, when the ground beneath her changed. Avery, he said. She looked up. It's moving, he said. In the right direction. She looked at him for a long moment. It's moved in the right direction before, she said. And then it moved back. I know, Cole said. But this time, there are more people holding it. She looked at him, at Sandra, at Marcus, coming back through the door with his phone out and his reading glasses down from his forehead for the first time all morning. She looked at the envelope. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. Okay, she said, and her voice was steadier than it had been since she arrived. Then let's keep moving. The call came at 11:47 that night. Cole was in the garage. He'd been there since 7, unwilling to leave, while Dylan had people on the perimeter, and the situation was fluid. Bear was there too, and 2 other senior members, Garrett and a man named Pete, who didn't say much, but was the most reliable person Cole had known in 20 years. The call came to Marcus's cell, not Cole's. Marcus had given his number to Sandra, who had given it to a source she'd called that afternoon, a source she wouldn't name yet, but whose voice on the other end of the phone had made Sandra's professional composure slip just slightly for just a moment. Marcus took the call in the corner of the garage, away from everyone, with one finger pressed against his free ear to block the noise. He talked for 4 minutes. When he hung up, he stood still for a moment before he walked back. He found Cole, Bear, Dylan, and Avery in a loose cluster near the office door. He said that was a former employee of the Langford Family Trust. He called Sandra's source 3 hours ago. He said he's been trying to report what he knows for 2 years, and nobody would take the meeting. Everyone was quiet. Marcus looked at Avery. He says he has internal communications, Marcus said. Emails, meeting notes, documents created inside the Langford organization itself, not gathered from outside it. Material that corroborates everything in your father's files from the inside. The silence in the garage was absolute. Avery said, "Why now? Why is he coming forward now?" "Because," Marcus said, and he paused just briefly, the way you pause before a sentence that changes the shape of everything. He saw the police request that came through this morning. He has a contact in the Billings DA's office who told him what was filed. The guardianship claim. The theft allegations. Marcus paused again. He said if they're doing that now, it means they're desperate. And desperate people do things that leave evidence. He said he's been waiting for Victor to make a move this obvious, because obvious moves can be traced. Bear said, "Who is he?" Marcus said, "His name is Gerald Foss. He was the Langford Trust's internal controller for 11 years. He processed the transactions. He built some of the shell structures himself before he understood what they were for." He paused. "He has everything. Account codes, internal authorizations, the names of the people inside the financial crimes unit who were contacted before your father's meeting." He looked at Avery. "Including the name of the person who tipped Langford off. The name of the person who tipped Langford off. The one piece Thomas Collins had never found. The piece that had made his case almost complete, but not quite the missing link between what Victor did and who inside the system had helped him do it." Avery stood completely still. Her face was controlled. She had spent 14 months training her face to stay controlled. But in her eyes, those pale gray eyes that Cole had learned to read over the past weeks, something was happening. Something was cracking open very slowly, not with grief, but with something that grief had been sitting on top of for a very long time. Something that was starting very carefully to look like the beginning of the end. "Where is he?" she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Missoula," Marcus said. "Sandra is already on her way to him." "When can we meet him?" "Tomorrow morning," Marcus said. "If you want to be there." Avery looked at Cole. Cole looked at her. He said, "We'll all be there." Avery nodded once. She looked at the envelope sitting on the desk through the office window. 14 months of running. 438 days of carrying something so heavy it had reshaped the way she held her body, the way she slept, the way she looked at every door in every room. Her father's work. Her father's death. The name of the person who helped make it happen finally within reach. She breathed in slowly. She breathed out. She looked at the garage around her. The bikes, the tools, the men who had become without any ceremony or announcement. The family she hadn't had since she was 18 years old, and the world she thought she lived in had collapsed. She thought about her father sitting across the kitchen table on a Friday night breakfast food at dinner, orange juice in a real glass, saying you have to be patient. The truth is always there. You just have to wait until the light hits it right. She thought, Dad. The light is hitting it. She didn't say that out loud. She turned back to the room. "Tonight," she said, "I want to go through the full file one more time. With Dylan. I want every piece documented in the order it connects to what Gerald Foss is about to bring." She paused. "If tomorrow goes the way I think it goes, we are not going to get a second chance to present this cleanly. I want it clean." Dylan looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, the permanent watchfulness in his expression softened into something that wasn't warmth exactly, but was its direct ancestor. "Then we work tonight," he said. They worked through the night, all of them. And when the morning came, gray and cold and wide open, every person in that garage was ready. They drove to Missoula in 2 vehicles. Cole drove the first, him, Avery, and Marcus. Dylan drove the second with Bear and Pete because Dylan had decided the night before, without asking anyone's opinion, that whatever was waiting in Missoula was not the kind of meeting where you showed up without people who could handle complications. Nobody argued with him. By now, everyone understood that Dylan's instincts operated at a frequency just below conscious thought, and that frequency had never once been wrong. It was a 2-hour drive. Avery sat in the passenger seat of Cole's truck with the envelope in her lap and her hands flat on top of it, and she watched the highway move under them and didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. Cole didn't push. He drove and drank coffee from a travel mug and let the silence exist because he'd learned by now that Avery's silences were working silences. She wasn't absent. She was processing, building, organizing the architecture of what was about to happen. At the 40-minute mark, she said. What if he gets cold feet? Cole said. Gerald Foss. He's been sitting on this for 2 years, she said. He reached out last night through Sandra's source. That's 3 degrees of separation from direct contact. That's a man who's afraid. Afraid people come forward, Cole said. Sometimes being afraid is exactly what makes someone finally move. And sometimes it's what makes them back out at the last minute, she said. When the reality of it gets close enough to touch. Cole thought about this honestly. If he backs out, he said, we go with what we have. Your father's files plus Gerald's testimony about Gerald's personal knowledge, even without the documents. A journalist who has already started independent verification. A sergeant who flagged a politically influenced detention request to the Attorney General's office. A documented pattern of intimidation and evidence suppression. He paused. A week ago, you had none of that. Today, you have all of it. Avery was quiet. My father had a case too, she said. A strong one, and it disappeared. Your father was alone, Cole said. She didn't answer, but her hands flat on the envelope pressed down slightly, the gesture he recognized now as her way of anchoring herself to something solid when everything else felt like it might shift. Cole drove. In the mirror, he could see Dylan's truck following at a steady distance, and that sight, those headlights constant and close, did something to his chest that he couldn't articulate and didn't try to. They were 40 minutes out from Missoula when Marcus's phone rang. Marcus looked at the screen. Sandra, he said, and answered. The call lasted 90 seconds. Marcus said 4 words during it, yes, when confirmed and understood. When he hung up, he turned from the back seat. Gerald Foss is at the location, he said. Sandra has been with him for 2 hours. She says he's scared, but he's talking. He paused. She also says he brought more than she expected. Avery looked at him. How much more? Marcus said. A hard drive. The truck was quiet. 11 years of internal communications, Marcus said. Emails, meeting minutes, transaction authorizations, and what Sandra is describing as a complete internal audit trail that the Foundation's own compliance team created and then suppressed. He held Avery's gaze, including the specific meeting where the decision was made to approach the contact inside the Financial Crimes Unit. Cole felt Avery go very still beside him. The name, she said. Not a question. A breath. Sandra has it, Marcus said. She's verified it against 2 independent sources. She's not ready to say it out loud yet, not until she's talked to legal, but she says it's solid. It's a real name, and it's connected to everything else, and when it comes out, it's going to be the piece that makes the whole structure impossible to deny. Avery turned to look out the windshield. Cole watched her from the corner of his eye. He watched her jaw set, and her shoulders pull back, and her hands tighten on the envelope, and then deliberately 1 finger at a time release. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, he's going to know. When this gets close enough, Victor is going to know. He probably already suspects, Marcus said. Gerald reaching out, crews going to the AG's office. These things don't happen in a vacuum. Langford has people watching. So he's going to move, Avery said. Before we can get the story published. Before the AG's office can act. He's going to try to collapse it. What does he do? Cole said. When he moves. What does his move look like? Avery had thought about this. She had thought about it the way you think about a storm you know is coming. Not with hope that it won't arrive, but with the specific focus of someone calculating exactly where to stand when it does. He attacks the source, she said. That's always been his pattern. When the evidence itself can't be destroyed, he destroys the credibility of the person carrying it. He goes after Gerald. He'll have something on Gerald, something real, or something fabricated that he holds in reserve for exactly this moment. Gerald built some of those shell structures himself. That's leverage. Marcus said, Gerald knows that. Which is why Gerald is scared, Avery said. And which is why we need to get to Gerald before Victor figures out that Gerald has already talked. Cole pressed the accelerator slightly. The highway moved faster under them. Sandra had chosen a meeting location that was anonymous without being dramatic about it. A conference room in the back of a law firm that belonged to a colleague of Marcus's, booked under the colleague's name with no digital trail connecting it to any of them. Smart. Professional. The kind of choice that told you, without anyone saying it, that Sandra Okafor had done this kind of work in situations where the wrong choice of location had cost people more than inconvenience. Gerald Foss was 60 years old and looked 70. He was a small man, thin in the way people get thin when they've been carrying something heavy for too long and the weight has consumed the reserves. He had fine gray hair and hands that moved constantly, not nervously, but with the restless energy of a person whose mind never stopped running even when the rest of him was standing still. He'd been the Langford Trust's internal controller for 11 years. He had processed over $240 million in transactions. He had believed for the first 7 of those years that what he was doing was exactly what it appeared to be, managing the finances of a legitimate charitable organization. The moment he understood it wasn't was a Tuesday afternoon in the 8th year when he traced a transfer that was supposed to go to a school construction project in rural Wyoming and found that it had gone through 3 shell entities, none of which were connected to education in any verifiable way, to an account in the Cayman Islands, registered to a company whose sole director was a name he recognized from the list of Victor Langford's personal attorneys. He had said nothing. For 3 years he said nothing because he was a man who had spent his entire career inside an institution. And the inside of institutions teaches you something specific, that the people who speak up are the ones who disappear, and the people who stay quiet are the ones who retire with their pensions. But Thomas Collins had spoken up. And Thomas Collins had died on a clear, dry night on a road he'd driven 500 times. And Gerald Foss had watched that happen from the inside, had known what it was, had understood with complete clarity what the car accident meant, and he had kept his silence anyway for 2 more years because he was afraid. He was not ashamed of being afraid. He had a wife and 2 grown children and a mortgage, and he was 60 years old, and afraid was the honest word for what he was. But here he was. Avery walked into the room, and Gerald looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You look like your father." The room was completely silent. Avery stood at the door for a moment. Then she came to the table and sat down across from Gerald, and she said, "You knew him." "I met him 4 times, Gerald said. "The first time was at a foundation audit review 3 years before he died. I knew immediately that he was going to find it. The way he moved through the records, he didn't look at the things you show an auditor. He looked at the things you don't show them." Gerald's hands moved on the table. "I was afraid of him at first. Then I was afraid for him. I thought about warning him. I didn't." "Why not?" Avery said. The question was direct and clean, with no accusation in it. Just a question. Gerald looked at her. "Because I was a coward," he said. "Because I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. Because I had a pension." He stopped. "He died, and I told myself it was an accident for about 48 hours. Then I stopped being able to tell myself that." He looked at the hard drive on the table between them. "I've been waiting for the right moment since then. I kept telling myself the moment hadn't come yet. Then I heard what Victor filed in Billings, the guardianship claim, the theft allegation against you, and I thought, there it is. That's what desperation looks like. And I thought about your father, who wasn't a coward, and I picked up the phone." Avery was looking at him steadily. She said, "The name. The person inside the financial crimes unit." Gerald said, "Deputy Director Alan Marsh." The name landed in the room. Cole, sitting 3 chairs down, kept his expression still by a conscious act of will. Marcus wrote it on his notepad and underlined it once. Sandra, who already knew it, watched Avery's face. Avery said, "Marsh, is he still in the position?" Gerald said, "He was promoted. He's now the director of the State Financial Crimes Division." The silence was different now. Heavier. Fuller. The silence of a room where everyone has just understood at the same moment the full dimensions of what they are dealing with. The man Thomas Collins had tried to take his evidence to was now running the very division that would be responsible for prosecuting Victor Langford. Cole said, "Can he bury this?" Marcus said, "If the case goes through his office without oversight, yes. He has the authority to classify, delay, reassign, or effectively kill an investigation at the divisional level." So we can't go through state financial crimes, Cole said. Not through Marsh, Marcus said. Then who? Bear said. He'd been standing against the wall quiet until now. Marcus said federal. If we take this to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, it bypasses Marsh entirely. Federal jurisdiction, federal oversight. Marsh has no authority there. Gerald said, Victor has federal contacts too, but they're thinner. He's spent 30 years building state-level infrastructure. Federal is harder to reach. Harder, not impossible, Avery said. Harder, not impossible, Gerald confirmed. Avery looked at Marcus. Can you make the federal contact? Marcus said, I know an assistant U.S. attorney in Helena. We were in law school together. She is, he chose his words carefully, the kind of person who has been waiting for something like this her entire career. Cole said, call her. Marcus was already reaching for his phone. The call to the assistant U.S. attorney took 11 minutes and changed everything in ways none of them could immediately measure. Her name was Patricia Voss. Marcus put her on speaker partly because the situation required transparency, and partly because Avery needed to hear the voice of the person who would be holding the next link in the chain. Patricia listened without interrupting for the first 8 minutes. She asked 3 questions. The third question was directed at Avery directly. Miss Collins, the files your father compiled, are they in their original form? No copies, no alterations, chain of custody intact. Avery said, original form. My father's handwriting on every annotation. I have never made a copy. I have never let them out of my physical possession. Patricia was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, I'm going to need to make some calls of my own before I can commit to anything formally. But I want you to know off the record as a private citizen, before I'm anything official, that what you've just described is the kind of case that changes things. Not just for Victor Langford. For the systems that allowed this to survive as long as it has. She paused. Your father was doing important work. I'm sorry it cost him what it cost him. Avery said, thank you. Patricia said, Marcus, I'll call you by end of day. Don't move the evidence. She hung up. The room breathed. Gerald was looking at Avery with an expression that was complicated, relieved, and grieving at the same time. The expression of a person for whom the right thing has finally been set in motion, and who knows that it cannot undo the years it took to get here. What happens to me, he said, when this goes federal? Marcus said, you cooperate fully, you produce everything on that drive, you provide sworn testimony. In exchange, I am going to argue, and I believe successfully, for immunity on the transactions you processed prior to your understanding of their purpose. The 3 years after your understanding, that's more complicated. But your value as a cooperating witness is significant, Gerald. Significant enough that the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to want to work with you, not against you. Gerald nodded slowly. He looked at the hard drive. He pushed it across the table to Marcus. 11 years, he said. Every transaction, every email, every meeting where decisions were made, and I sat in the room and said nothing, and went home and told myself it wasn't my problem. He stopped. I want it out of my hands. Marcus took it. Bear from the wall said very quietly, It took courage to come here today, Gerald. Gerald looked at him. At this enormous, serious man who had said the thing plainly, without ceremony, without falseness. It took too long, Gerald said. Bear said, Yeah, but you came. Gerald looked at the table, and for just a moment in the set of his shoulders, something released. They were back in Redwood Valley by 4 in the afternoon. The garage was quiet when they returned. The other members had kept it running during the day, the ordinary work of engines and parts, and the small continuous maintenance of things that needed keeping. Cole walked in and smelled oil and coffee, and something cooking on the hot plate someone had brought in, and the ordinariness of it hit him unexpectedly. The way ordinary things do when you've been inside something serious for too long. He sat down on a workbench. Bear sat beside him. They didn't say anything for a minute. Then Bear said, You think Langford already knows? It wasn't a question. Cole said, He knows something moved today. He doesn't know exactly what yet. Bear said, How long before he does? Cole said, Patricia Voss makes her calls by end of day. Some of those calls go to people who are careful. But information moves. 24 hours. Maybe less. Bear was quiet. Cole said Dylan. Dylan appeared from the back of the garage, the way Dylan always appeared, as if he'd been in the room the whole time. The perimeter, Cole said. Double it tonight. Dylan said, already done. I called Garrett and 2 others while you were driving back. We have eyes on the building, the alley, and Colton Street. Cole nodded. He looked at the office window through which he could see Avery at the desk. She had come back in and gone straight to work, not because there was filing to do, but because working was how she managed the waiting, how she always had. She was going through the cross-reference system she'd built, checking it, tightening it, making sure everything was in the right order for whenever it would be needed. She was 20 years old. She had been carrying this since she was 18. Cole thought about his daughter in Billings, about the phone call he hadn't made. He thought about what Avery had said in the office weeks ago. Maybe it's not too late. He picked up his phone, put it in his jacket pocket. Later. Not now, but later. He stood up. The first call came from Patricia Voss at 6:47 in the evening. She called Marks, who was still at the garage, who took the call on speaker in the office with Cole, Dylan, Bear, and Avery. Patricia said, I've spoken to the FBI field office in Helena. I've spoken to 2 colleagues in the Financial Crimes Division. I want to be careful about what I say at this stage because nothing is formally committed. She paused. But I am going to tell you that the response I received was not what I expected. Marcus said, how so? Patricia said, I expected interest. What I got was urgency. It turns out that the FBI Financial Crimes Division has had a flag on the Langford Foundation for 14 months. An independent flag not connected to Thomas Collins's investigation, not connected to Avery. A separate inquiry that was initiated through a completely different channel, and that has been moving very slowly because it lacked a specific piece it couldn't find. The room was very still. What piece? Marcus said. Patricia said, the internal transaction trail, the shell structures, and the account routing. The FBI had the public-facing numbers, but couldn't get inside the organization's own documentation to prove intentionality versus accounting error. She stopped. Gerald Foss's hard drive is apparently exactly what they've been missing for 14 months. Gerald's hard drive. The thing Gerald had been sitting on for 2 years. The thing Gerald had brought to a meeting in Missoula because a 20-year-old girl's father had been brave enough to build a case that got him killed, and the weight of that bravery had finally become heavier than Gerald's fear. Cole looked at Avery. Avery was looking at Marcus. Her hands were in her lap, and she was not pressing them against the desk. She was just sitting with them, open palms up, the way a person sits when they are not holding anything back. Sandra, who had been in the corner with her laptop open since they got back, looked up. Her expression was not triumph. She had been doing this work long enough to know that triumph was premature and usually punished. But there was something in her face that was unmistakably alive. Marcus said, Patricia, what is the next step? Patricia said, the FBI wants to take formal custody of the evidence, both Thomas Collins's files and Gerald's hard drive. They want to move this into a federal investigation immediately with Gerald as the primary cooperating witness. They want Avery's testimony as a witness, not as a suspect. I want that clearly understood. The guardianship claim and the theft allegations from Billings are being reviewed by the AG's office, and my preliminary read is that they will be withdrawn when the federal investigation becomes public, because pursuing them will be prosecutorial suicide for anyone connected to Langford at that point. Everyone in the room was listening with the total attention of people who have been running toward something for a very long time and can finally see the edge of it. When? Avery said. One word. Direct. Patricia said, tomorrow morning. I'd like Marcus to bring you to Helena. I'll have federal agents present. We do this formally properly with full legal protections in place. No loose ends. Avery said, okay. Then she said, is Langford going to know tonight? Patricia was quiet for a moment. I can't guarantee what gets out and when, she said honestly. I'm being as careful as I can be. But you should operate on the assumption that information moves and plan accordingly. Avery said, thank you, Patricia. Patricia said, thank your father. He built the case. You kept it safe. That's not a small thing." She hung up. The office held everything that had just happened for a long moment. Then Dylan said, "We need to move tonight." Cole said, "What?" Dylan said, "If Langford finds out we're going to Helena tomorrow morning, he has tonight to act. I don't want Avery in this building tonight." Cole looked at him. "Where?" Cole said. Dylan said, "My place. Off Colton 2 streets back. Langford's people don't know it exists. I've never been connected to this address officially." He looked at Avery. "Pack what you need. Just the essentials and the evidence." Avery looked at Dylan. At this man who had watched her for weeks with his arms crossed and his jaw set, who had been the last to trust and the most dangerous when he finally did. She said, "Okay." She stood up and went to pack. Bear looked at Dylan and said low, "You sure about your place?" Dylan said, "I've been sure about her since the inventory analysis." Bear looked at him. Dylan said, "She caught fraud from one engine report. She identified a surveillance vehicle from a peripheral window angle. She walked into a room with a man recording her and clocked the second phone in his jacket pocket before he said 10 words. He paused. I know what a trained investigator's child looks like. I know what it looks like when someone was raised to see things." Bear said, "You're saying she's been right this whole time." Dylan said, "I'm saying Thomas Collins spent his whole life teaching her how to look past what people show you to what they're hiding." Victor Langford spent 14 months trying to hide from a girl who was trained from childhood to find exactly what he was hiding. He looked at the office door. There was only ever going to be one way this ended. Bear was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah." He went to go make sure the garage was secured for the night. Victor Langford called Richard Hale at 9:43 in the evening. This was information Dylan learned later. 2 weeks later, when the federal investigation had already surfaced enough of the communication record to reconstruct the timeline. But the content of that call would matter enormously in the weeks ahead, so it belongs here in the order of things. Victor said, "I want her stopped before tomorrow." Richard said, "Stopped how?" Victor said, "I don't care. Buy it. Threaten it. Find the weakness and use it." He paused. "Everyone has the weakness." Richard said, "She doesn't have any money. She doesn't have any reputation to protect. She doesn't have any family we can reach. She has nothing." Victor said, "Then find what she does have. Find who matters to her and use that." Richard said, "The garage." Victor said, "The garage." Richard said, "You want to go after them." Victor said, "I want this finished." What Victor Langford did not know, could not have known, because the information wasn't available to him, was that at the moment he made that call, Avery Collins was not in the garage on Colton Street. She was in a quiet house 2 streets away, sitting at a kitchen table with the evidence beside her with Dylan Marsh on one side and Cole Harrison's phone number on speed dial, and 32 men who had decided that whatever came through the door would have to go through all of them first. The weakness Victor was looking for did not exist. Because the one thing Avery Collins had built in 23 days in a motorcycle garage in Redwood Valley, Montana, was the one thing Victor Langford had spent his entire career systematically destroying in everyone who threatened him. She had built people who would not move, and Richard Hale, when he drove down Colton Street at 10 in the evening and found the garage locked and dark and empty, would call Victor back and say, "She's not here." And Victor Langford would have his first real moment of understanding what he was actually up against. Not a frightened girl running alone. Something else entirely. Something that had roots now. And roots, as every man who has ever tried to pull something out of the ground knows, are the hardest thing in the world to destroy. Richard Hale called Victor Langford back at 10:22 in the evening and said 4 words, "She's not here anymore." The silence on Victor's end of that call lasted 7 seconds. Richard had worked for Victor Langford for 9 years, and he had learned to measure the man's emotional state, not by what he said, but by the length and texture of his silences. 7 seconds was the longest he had ever heard. It was the silence of a man who has built his entire strategy on a specific assumption and has just been told the assumption was wrong. Victor said, "Find her." Richard said, "She could be anywhere in the county if she moved tonight with professional help." Victor said. "I don't want excuses. I want her found before morning." Richard said, "Victor, if she's already made contact with federal authorities." Victor said, "She hasn't. She can't have. Not yet." His voice had changed, thinned, hardened, lost the smooth public warmth that was his most practiced instrument. This was the voice underneath the voice, the one that nobody heard at galas or hospital wing dedications. "Move tonight. Use everything." Richard hung up and sat alone with the weight of what everything meant, and for the first time in 9 years of working for Victor Langford, he asked himself a question he had never asked before. What happens when this ends? Not if. When? Because in 9 years, he had watched Victor Langford apply pressure to people until they broke or disappeared, and he had told himself it was business, it was necessary, it was the cost of the good work. The Foundation also genuinely did. He had told himself that right up until this moment, sitting in a dark car on an empty street in Redwood Valley, Montana, staring at a locked garage and understanding that somewhere in this town, a 20-year-old girl was sitting with evidence that would not disappear, protected by people who would not move. And tomorrow morning she was going to walk into a federal building and hand over 14 months of her life and her dead father's work. And there was nothing left to do that wouldn't make everything worse. Richard Hale sat in his car. He made one call. Not to Victor's other contacts. Not to the men who handled the kind of work Victor meant when he said, "Use everything." He called Marcus Reeves. Marcus answered on the third ring. Richard said, "I need to talk to someone, tonight. Not as Victor's representative, as myself." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you?" Cole got the call from Marcus at 11:15. He was sitting in Dylan's kitchen with a cup of coffee, and Dylan across the table, and Avery on the couch in the next room. Not sleeping, but not talking either. Just existing in the quiet, suspended state of someone who is hours away from a thing they have been moving toward for so long that being almost there feels unreal. Marcus said, "Richard Hale just called me." Cole said, "Richard Hale." Marcus said, "He wants to cooperate." The kitchen was completely silent. Dylan, who could read Cole's face the way Cole could read his, went still. Cole said, "What does that mean, cooperate?" Marcus said, "It means he's been Langford's fixer for 9 years, and he's been keeping records, personal records. Not because he planned to use them, he says he doesn't know exactly why he kept them, except that some part of him always knew this day would come, and he wanted something that proved he wasn't the architect. He was the instrument." Marcus paused. "Cole, he has communications that prove Victor personally directed the contact with Alan Marsh. Personal communications. Victor's voice in writing explicitly directing the suppression of Thomas Collins's investigation." Cole closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Thomas Collins, who drove off a clear, dry highway on a road he'd driven 500 times, and the question that had lived underneath everything since Avery said those words. Not an accident. Not mechanical failure. Just off the road. That question was about to get an answer. Nobody in this story had expected to receive this soon. "Is there more?" Cole said. Marcus said, "He says there's documentation of the accident, that it wasn't." He stopped. "Cole, he says he has a communication from Victor 3 days before Thomas Collins died, saying the situation needed to be resolved permanently." Cole put the coffee mug down on the table very carefully. Dylan was watching him. Cole said, "Marcus, is he willing to put this in front of federal agents?" Marcus said, "That's why he called me. He wants protection. He wants a deal. He wants to sit across from Patricia Voss's colleagues tomorrow morning and put everything on the table." Cole said, "What do you need from me tonight?" Marcus said, "Keep Avery safe until morning. That's all. Just morning." Cole said, "Done," and hung up. He looked at Dylan. Dylan said, "How bad?" Cole said, "It wasn't an accident." Dylan's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. "Her father," Dylan said. "There's documentation," Cole said. "Hale has it. He's coming in tomorrow." Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Cole stood up and walked to the doorway of the room where Avery was sitting. She looked up. She read his face the way she always did, immediately accurately. She said, "What happened?" Cole said, "Richard Hale called Marcus. He's cooperating. He has documentation that clears up the last piece, the piece about your father's accident." He stopped. "Avery, it's going to confirm what you already believed. Are you ready for that?" Avery looked at him for a long time. She had known. Of course she had known. For 439 days she had known, in the deep wordless place where the body stores its truths, that her father had not simply driven off a road. She had known it the way she knew everything her father had taught her to know, by looking past what was shown to what was hidden, and understanding that clear, dry nights and 500 times driven roads and no skid marks added up to only one thing. She had known. And she had carried that knowing alone, without confirmation, without the terrible relief of certainty, for 439 days. She said yes. Cole nodded. He went back to the kitchen. Avery sat alone in the room and pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and breathed in and breathed out, and let the knowing settle into the place where the not knowing had been. And she said to her father, not out loud, just inside, just to him, "I found it, Dad. We found it. It took too long and it cost too much, and I'm sorry I couldn't do it faster. But we found it." She didn't cry. She had decided a long time ago that she would cry when it was over. Not before. Not yet. Morning came hard and fast. They left Dylan's place at 6:45 in 2 vehicles, same formation as the day before, and this time there was a third vehicle. Marcus in his own car, with Richard Hale in the passenger seat, and the atmosphere in that car, which Marcus would describe later as the most uncomfortable 2 hours of his professional life, was the specific atmosphere of a man dismantling mile by mile the architecture of his own complicity. Richard Hale said very little during the drive. What he did say, Marcus recorded with Richard's consent, because Marcus was not a man who left things to memory when documentation was available. Richard said, "I want you to know I understood what I was doing. I'm not going to sit in front of federal agents and tell them I didn't know. I knew. I told myself 100 different things to make it acceptable, and none of them were true." He paused. "Thomas Collins was a good man. I met him once, at a foundation review. He shook my hand and thanked me for the work the foundation was doing. He didn't know I was the one who cleaned up the paperwork that made the fraud invisible." Richard stopped. "I've thought about that handshake for 3 years. Marcus said nothing. Richard said, "Is his daughter going to be in the room tomorrow?" Marcus said, "Yes." Richard said, "Okay." One word. Flat. Carrying everything. They drove the rest of the way to Helena in silence. Patricia Voss met them in the lobby of the federal building at 9 in the morning. She was 51 tall, with the kind of face that had been both softened and made more serious by decades of work in rooms where the truth was always more complicated than anyone wanted it to be. She shook Marcus's hand. She shook Cole's hand. She looked at Dylan and nodded the nod of someone who recognizes a particular kind of person on sight. She shook Bear's hand, and her eyebrows moved very slightly at the size of him. Then she turned to Avery. She looked at her for a moment. She said, "I read everything Marcus sent me last night. Every page of your father's files." She paused. "He was meticulous. His sourcing is among the best I've seen from a private investigator in 20 years of practice." Avery said, "I was the best at what he did." Patricia said, "I believe you." She paused. "We're going to take care of this properly today. Every step documented, every protection in place. You have nothing to fear from this room." Avery said, "I know." Patricia looked at her for a moment longer, at this 20-year-old woman who had walked into this building with a backpack that held 14 months of her life, and her dead father's work, and the kind of steadiness that is not the absence of fear, but its complete and deliberate mastery. Patricia said quietly, "Your father would be proud." Avery held her gaze. Something moved through her face, brief, deep, private. She said, "Thank you." They went inside. The meeting lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Avery gave her testimony first. She sat across from 2 federal agents and Patricia Voss and a woman from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division named Agent Torres, who had the specific focused energy of someone who had been working toward this particular intersection for 14 months and was now sitting in the room where it was finally happening. Avery laid out everything in order: her father's discovery, the timeline of suppression, the escalating pressure, the flight, the 439 days. She was precise and organized and clear, and twice during her testimony, Agent Torres stopped her and said, "Back up one step," because she was moving fast, and Torres wanted every detail exactly right. And Avery backed up and gave it exactly right, and Torres nodded and said, "Continue." When Avery finished, Torres looked at her notes for a moment. She said, "Miss Collins, the files your father compiled. He began this investigation how many years ago?" "He identified the first anomaly 7 years before he died," Avery said. "He spent 4 years documenting it before he made contact with the Financial Crimes Division." Torres said, "He spent 4 years building this case, knowing that it was dangerous." "Yes," Avery said. Torres said, "And you've spent 14 months carrying it." "Yes." Torres looked at the files, all of them spread across the table in the organization Avery had maintained since day one. She looked at Gerald's hard drive, which Marcus had placed in a secure evidence bag the night before. She looked at the documentation Richard Hale had provided, which was sitting in a separate folder with its own chain of custody record. She said, "We've been trying to build this case from the outside for over a year. Everything we needed was already here. Your father built it. You protected it." She paused. "I want you to understand what this means. This is not a small case. The network we're looking at extends beyond Victor Langford. The shell structures Gerald Foss documented touch entities in 3 states. The communication Hale provided connects Langford directly to Alan Marsh's actions, which means we're looking at federal corruption charges alongside the financial crimes." She stopped. "This is going to take time to prosecute fully. But the investigation that begins today, it begins with a foundation that is almost unassailable because your father was meticulous and you kept it safe." The room was quiet. Cole, sitting against the wall, found that he was holding his breath and let it go. Bear had his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes slightly bright, which for Bear was the equivalent of crying. Dylan was completely still, which for Dylan was the equivalent of everything. Avery said, "When does it become public?" Torres said, "Sandra Okafor is coordinating with our press office. We want the federal investigation made public before Langford has time to activate any contingency. Sandra's story runs the moment we give her the signal, which will be this afternoon after we've secured the key witnesses and evidence." Avery said, "And Victor." Torres said, "Federal agents are serving a warrant at Victor Langford's Billings office at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Simultaneously, Alan Marsh is being placed on administrative leave pending investigation." She paused. "We move fast today because fast is the only language that works with someone who has this many contacts." Avery nodded. She looked at the envelope. Her father's envelope, now officially entered into federal evidence, signed and documented and protected by the full weight of the system her father had tried to reach and been prevented from reaching. She pressed her hand flat on the table. One last time. Then she lifted it. "Okay," she said. "Then let's finish it." Sandra's story went live at 3:47 in the afternoon. The headline read, "Langford Family Trust Faces Federal Investigation in Decades-Long Money Laundering Scheme. Whistleblowers Reveal Coordinated Suppression of Evidence." Within 2 hours, it had been picked up by 14 news outlets. Within 4 hours, it was the lead story on 3 network affiliates. Within 6 hours, Victor Langford's attorney released a statement calling the allegations baseless and politically motivated. The statement was 12 sentences long and contained the word fabricated 4 times. Within 8 hours, Gerald Foss gave his first on-record interview to Sandra Okafor, in which he described in specific and documented detail the internal mechanisms of the fraud he had helped build and had spent 3 years failing to dismantle and one day dismantling completely. His voice on the recording was steady. He had made his choice, and he was living inside it now, and whatever it cost him, he was done paying the other kind of cost. Alan Marsh resigned from his position as director of the State Financial Crimes Division at 6 in the evening, citing personal reasons in a statement. His attorney released that was 3 sentences long and contained no denial of the specific allegations, because his attorney had been informed by federal prosecutors that the evidence against him was comprehensive enough that denial would be counterproductive. Victor Langford was formally arrested at 7:41 in the evening at his Billings home. The news footage showed him walking out the front door of a house that had a hospital wing named after him, and a gala hosted in his name every year, and his face on the front page of the Billings Gazette every 6 months for donating something to someone. He was wearing a gray suit, and his expression was composed and controlled because Victor Langford was to the end a man who understood performance. But the cameras caught his eyes for just a moment as he was guided to the car. And in his eyes, there was not rage, not defiance. There was the specific look of a man who has been outmaneuvered by something he fundamentally underestimated and knows in this moment exactly where he went wrong. He went wrong in October, on a cold, rainy night, when a 20-year-old girl with a bruise on her cheek and a torn backpack knocked on the door of the one place in Redwood Valley where people valued loyalty above reputation, and the man who opened the door looked at her and saw something worth keeping. Avery watched the news footage on Cole's phone in the garage parking lot. She was standing outside in the cold, the same cold as that first night October air, the smell of rain somewhere in the distance, and Cole was standing beside her, and they watched the footage together without saying anything. When it ended, she handed the phone back. She stood for a moment. Then she said, "It's not done. The trial will take years." "I know," Cole said. "Victor's attorneys are going to fight every piece of it," she said. "They're going to try to discredit Gerald. They're going to try to discredit my father's methodology. They're going to make it as long and as expensive and as painful as they possibly can." "I know," Cole said. "And Alan Marsh." "Avery," Cole said. She stopped. He said, "I know, all of it. It's not over, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to take time." He paused. "But look at where you're standing." She looked at him. He said, 3 weeks ago you were standing outside this building in the rain. Nowhere to go. No one on your side. Carrying something so heavy, it had been reshaping you for over a year." He paused. "Look at where you're standing now." Avery looked around her. At the garage, the lights on inside, the sound of work, the radio playing something low. At Bear, through the window, moving between bikes, enormous and steady and reliable as anything she had ever known. At Dylan's truck parked at the edge of the lot. Dylan himself leaning against it with his arms crossed and his eyes on the street, still watching, always watching, because that was who Dylan was, and he wasn't going to stop being who he was just because the immediate danger had passed. She looked at Marcus's car, at Sandra's number in her phone, at the federal evidence receipt in her jacket pocket, the piece of paper that said the envelope was now in the custody of the United States government, signed by Agent Torres, dated today. She looked at all of it, and she thought about her father, who had spent his whole career finding the thing everyone else walked past, and who had given her the most important thing he found, and trusted her to carry it to the place where it could do what it needed to do. She had carried it. She had found the place. She said, he would have liked this garage. Cole said, yeah. He liked places where people worked with their hands, she said. He said it was honest, that there was something about physical work that kept people from lying to themselves for too long. She almost smiled. He would have liked all of you. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the job. The one you asked for that first night. He looked at her. It's yours, officially. Full-time. Manager of operations, which means you run the office and the inventory systems, and you yell at me when the filing gets bad. He paused. You interested? Avery looked at him. She said, you're offering me a real job. I'm offering you a real job, he said. With a real salary, and your name on the door, and the padlock stays on the back room as long as you want it. She looked at the garage. She thought about the first morning arriving before everyone else, cleaning the office, organizing the paperwork, finding the billing error, standing at the inventory shelf with her legal pad. She thought about Bear's sandwich at lunch, Dylan's question about the engine report, Cole's coffee in the office at 5:40 in the morning. She thought about the cross-reference system on the legal pad. She thought about all the small, quiet, ordinary moments of working in a place where the work mattered and the people noticed, and nobody asked her to be less than she was. She thought about what it had felt like on the first morning to be useful, to be somewhere, to stop running. She said yes. Cole said good, and went back inside. Avery stood alone for one more moment. The cold was real, and the night was coming in, and somewhere in Billings, a man who had spent 30 years building a perfect public surface was sitting in a room learning what it felt like when the surface gave way. Somewhere her father's files were being scanned and entered into federal records, and his careful, meticulous, honest work was becoming the architecture of a case that would take years to prosecute, and would, when it concluded, be the thing that defined his career, not the way Victor Langford had tried to define it, but the way it actually was the work of the best investigator in the state, who found the thing everyone else walked past, who taught his daughter how to see, who trusted her with the most important thing he'd found, and who was right to trust her. She breathed in. She breathed out. She went inside. 3 months later, Cole Harrison made a phone call. He made it on a Friday evening, which was not a coincidence, because Avery had told him once that her father had always made the important calls on Friday evenings. Something about the end of a week, making a person braver, more honest, more willing to say the thing they'd been building up to saying. He called his daughter in Billings. She answered on the fourth ring, with a voice that was careful and slightly surprised, and underneath both of those things, something that had been waiting. Cole said, "Hey, sweetheart, it's Dad. I know it's been a while." He paused. "I was wondering if we could talk." She said, "Yeah, Dad, we can talk." Cole sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you I'm sorry. For real this time. Not the kind of sorry that's really asking you to make me feel better about it. Just I'm sorry, and I'm listening if you want to talk." There was a long silence. Then his daughter said, "Okay." And her voice had changed. Something had come loose in it, some tension that had been held for 3 years, and Cole heard it give way, and felt it give way in his own chest simultaneously. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. When he hung up, he sat alone in the office for a moment. Through the window, he could see Avery at the inventory shelf. She was doing the Wednesday parts count, which she did every Wednesday because she had determined that a weekly count prevented the errors that the monthly count had always missed. She had her legal pad and her pencil behind her ear, and she was counting with the methodical, focused attention she brought to everything fully present, fully herself, fully there. Cole watched her for a moment. He thought about the first night, the bruise, the torn backpack, the rain, the words that had changed everything. "I don't need anyone to save me. I just need a chance to earn my way out." He thought about what he'd said after they didn't save Avery. They gave her a place where she could save herself. But that wasn't entirely true, he realized now. Because saving yourself and being saved are not always opposites. Sometimes they are the same motion seen from 2 different angles. Sometimes the place where you save yourself is the place where someone held the door open and said, "Come in out of the rain, and tomorrow you show me something worth keeping." Sometimes the people who give you the foothold are as essential as the climbing, and the climbing is as essential as the foothold, and neither one works without the other. He stood up. He went back out onto the garage floor. Bear looked up from the engine he was working on and said, "How'd it go?" Cole said, "Good." He picked up a wrench. "Really good." Bear looked at him for a moment, nodded once, went back to work. The radio played something low. The garage kept moving. 6 months after the night, she had walked through the door with a bruise on her cheek and nowhere to go. Avery Collins stood in that same doorway. But this time, she was on the inside looking out. It was a Tuesday evening. The rain was back October again, the same cold, the same wet smell, the kind of night that circles back and shows you who you have become since the last time it found you. She was holding a coffee mug in both hands, and she was watching the street where an unfamiliar car had been parked for 20 minutes, and something in her, the trained watchfulness, her father's instinct living on in her body, had made her look twice. She watched. The car door opened. A young woman got out, maybe 22 or 23. She was wearing a thin jacket not warm enough for the weather. She was carrying a bag. She was standing on the sidewalk outside the garage, looking at the door the way someone stands when they want to go somewhere, but aren't sure if they're allowed. Avery set down her coffee mug. She walked to the door and opened it. The young woman looked at her. Avery looked at her, at the thin jacket and the uncertain posture and the eyes that were scanning the space the way a person's eyes scan when they have learned somewhere along the way that spaces have to be assessed before they're trusted. She recognized it. Of course she recognized it. Avery said, "Come in out of the rain." The young woman hesitated. Avery said, "It's okay, we're still open." The young woman came in. Bear looked up from the engine. Dylan looked up from the parts bin. Cole at his workbench looked across the floor and met Avery's eyes for a moment. Avery looked back at the young woman. She said, "What do you need?" The young woman looked at the garage, at the bikes, the tools, the men, the work, the ordered and honest and physical reality of a place where things were fixed and people were useful and nobody asked you to be less than you were. She said quietly, "I don't know. I didn't know where else to go." Avery nodded. She put her hand briefly on the young woman's arm, just a touch, just a moment, and said, "That's okay, you're here now." And the garage kept working. The radio played something low. Bear made coffee. Dylan went back to the parts bin, which meant he was paying attention. Cole set down his wrench and walked over, because Cole Harrison had learned 6 months ago that the most important thing you can do for a person standing at the edge of what they can carry is walk toward them rather than wait. And Avery Collins, the girl who had walked through that door with nothing but her father's truth and the stubborn, unbreakable belief that she could earn her way through whatever came next, stood in the place that had become her home, surrounded by the people who had become her family, and understood something her father had always tried to tell her, and that she had finally fully lived her way into knowing. The door that looks most unlikely is sometimes the one that leads exactly where you need to go. And the people who look most unlikely are sometimes the ones who hold it open longest. And the girl who everyone thought was the weakest person in the room was the whole time the one carrying the thing that made the whole room possible. That truth did not need a monument. It did not need a speech. It lived in a motorcycle garage in Redwood Valley, Montana, in the hum of an engine and the scratch of a pencil on a legal pad, and the sound of Bear's coffee, and Dylan's silence, and Cole's steady hands on a wrench that had work left to do. It lived in a 20-year-old woman who had been broken and had not broken, who had been alone and was no longer, who had been running and had finally completely, irrevocably stopped. Not because the danger was gone, not because the battle was finished, but because she had found the place where the running ended and the living began, and she had earned every inch of it, and she was never,